Welcome. My name's Peter Tatham. I'm President of ABC Friends Tasmania. So just welcome everyone here tonight to this free event. But if you'd like to make a donation, we've got donations box outside after the event. So please think about that. There's also some merch there if you'd be interested in doing some merch. And if you're so enthralled by the ABC Friends presentation tonight, please think about joining our committee. Let me begin by paying my respects to the traditional and original owners of this land, the Muwinina people, and pay respects to those who have passed before us, and to acknowledge today's Tasmanian Aboriginal people who are the custodians of this land. It's my pleasure to introduce Margaret Simons here tonight, and thanks very much for coming, Margaret. Sometimes in writing things down, we find out what we think about an issue. And occasionally someone helps us along and a fair bit. So often Margaret Simons does the heavy lifting for people like myself and many of the ABC friends here, putting forward ideas that matter about power, democracy, equality, social equity, misinformation and the declining relevance of the Murdoch media and legacy media more generally. And also about the joys of urban gardening. Like the gardener she is and writer about it, 6 square metres, and the story of compost, which could be about the Tasmanian Parliament if you think about it. Margaret is able to till the soil of an idea into food for thought. She notices the nuances and explains the complex so it makes sense. Margaret has been an astute observer of Australian politics over a long period of time, having written biographical pieces on Mark Latham, Malcolm Fraser, and the 2 recent biographies of Penny Wong and Tanya Plibersek. As a valued Australian academic, freelance journalist and author, she has never shied away from asking difficult questions about who controls our news, how information shapes democracy, and what the future holds for public service media. In her quarterly essay, Crimea River, she untangled the web of environmental politics, exposing how vested interests were shaping government policy and public understanding. Her work exemplifies the very essence of journalism, contributing as a trusted player and sharing news and views that add to our social cohesion and promote critical thinking. In today's rapidly evolving landscape where artificial intelligence disrupts media, corporate interests threaten journalistic independence, and digital algorithms shape what we see, Margaret's insights could not be more important. We're all here because we know that journalism, that truth, that shared understanding matter, that democracy depends on an informed and engaged public, and that public service media like the ABC provides balance, informs, and when done well, and fearlessly keeps power accountable. Tonight, Margaret will challenge us to think critically about the forces shaping our information ecosystem and ask the fundamental question, intelligence, democracy and public service media, what does the future hold? Can I ask you to give a warm welcome to tonight's speaker, Margaret Simons. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that flattering introduction, and if I can just add my own acknowledgement to the traditional owners of this land. It's a great pleasure to be here in Hobart. I must admit I hadn't realised I was an attraction in Dark Mofa, but happy to be so. And it's been a particular pleasure in preparing for tonight to find out a little bit more about Andrew Bent, for whom this lecture is named, an extraordinary man who I wasn't entirely familiar with before. I'm sure this audience knows Bent effectively established the free press in Australia, or at least gave it its first expression, when in 1824, and contrary to the orders of the Lieutenant Governor, Colonel George Arthur, he published his newspaper without first submitting the proofs for government approval. Later, he was jailed for libel more than once, but you can read all about that history in many places, I'm glad to say. But what struck me most about Bent's story was that such a courageous, contrary and stubborn man came from such a disadvantaged background. He was born in 1791 at St Giles in the Fields in London, and he was a pauper by the time he was 17 years old and an orphan. Probably around the time he was 15, we're not quite sure of the date, he was already an apprentice to a printer. He was learning the means of publication and how to produce a newspaper. And newspapers, of course, were still relatively new back then. They were one of the most powerful and to some frightening innovations of his times. He was now 19 when he was found guilty of theft and 21 when he arrived in Hobart. By the age of just 24, he had been appointed government printer, and the actions he took in establishing the free press occurred when he was 33. Now, he was clearly a difficult man in the best sense. Not all the causes he advocated would win approval in modern-day Hobart or even be understood. But that is, of course, not the point and not the reason he is celebrated today and has this lecture in his name. We celebrate him because he was courageous, because of his values, and because he was a subversive. Now, I was walking around Hobart this afternoon, trying to stay out of the wind, and visited a couple of the sites of Bent's life here, and I found myself wondering if he was with us today, what would he be doing? He would surely not be founding a newspaper. He once published an article denouncing Colonel Arthur as a Gideonite of tyranny. You could look it up, I did. If he wanted to say that today about, say, the Premier of Tasmania, where would he do it? Not, I think, in a newspaper. I think we know the answer. He would be on social media. He would be on TikTok. Perhaps he would have a podcast. Perhaps he would be an influencer. And then he might be interviewed by the ABC. Because the locus of media influence has shifted. Whereas once freedom of speech, freedom of the press in particular, belonged to those who had a press, or in more recent times, access to a broadcasting licence, now it's much more broadly spread. Now, I want to move in a moment to talk about the Albanese government's very popular, but I think misguided, attempts to prevent teenagers under the age of 16, the age Bent was when he was learning to print, from participating in social media. But first, and because by definition this audience is interested in the ABC, I want to talk about that institution's history in navigating the new media world. And later I'll have some things to say about what the future might hold and the role we should expect the ABC to play. Now, the main thing I'm doing at the moment, my main project, is writing a history of the ABC. I'm picking up where the historian Ken Inglis left off. I'm sure he'll be familiar to many of you. He wrote 2 volumes of history of the ABC from founding up to 2005. I'm picking up the story in 2006 when Mark Scott walks into the building as managing director to serve a 10-year term. Now, 2006 was a hugely significant year. Perhaps we can only see just how significant looking back at it. It was the year Twitter was launched. It was the year Facebook became available to the general public rather than only to students on campuses. And there was a sense of wonder and optimism about social media, as well as a deal of fear. A few years later, starting in 2010, there was the Arab Spring, with social media being the means by which pro-democracy protests rocked the Middle East. At about the same time, China had Weibo and then WeChat, and it seemed for a little while impossible that censorship and therefore autocracy could survive this new innovation. Of course, people had said the same thing about newspapers when they were invented. Now, Mark Scott was nothing if not an optimist about new media in general, including social media. This was partly because he had seen where the failure to understand and embrace the future could lead. He had been a senior manager at Fairfax newspapers and had seen the decline of their influence, indeed presided over some of it. He'd witnessed the journey from the days when people would queue up outside newspaper offices to get the news hot off the press, to the days when people asked why they were called newspapers when everything in them happened yesterday. He'd seen the main source of revenue, classified advertising, disappear to online platforms, and he'd seen newspapers once so mighty become thinner, less influential, and in some cases entirely redundant. And at the same time, of course, television stations were also challenged because the audience fragmented, no longer gathering around a single television in the evening, but rather everybody on a separate screen, often in separate rooms. But whereas commercial media was undermined by the fact that everyone was watching multiple screens, he thought the ABC could embrace it After all, it didn't have to worry about making money from gathering that audience and selling it to advertisers. It just had to get the content out in the interest of the Australian people. It could embrace all the new platforms, spread its content as widely as possible, both on platforms it owned and controlled and elsewhere, Facebook, Twitter, and when they came along, Instagram, TikTok, and the rest. When Scott joined the ABC in 2006, and it's hard to think back that far, it had a single television channel. ABC2 had been established but was very restricted by government regulation as to what it could show. Radio stations were delivered mainly through the airwaves. There were some podcasts. The ABC was an early innovator there. But by the time Scott left 10 years later, there were 4 television channels, plus iView, plus an ABC Kids app, a rural app, and many others, as well as whole ecosystems of digital radio channels, such as those around Triple J. When Scott announced his departure in 2015, he did an exit interview with the Australian Financial Review, and the interviewer noted that he had a brand new Apple Watch on his wrist, a technology that had been released only 2 months before. It was the latest device on which media content, including ABC content, could be consumed. Now, it's hard to believe now, hard to credit, but up until 2013, there was a raging controversy, at least at the Australian, about whether the ABC should be publishing on the World Wide Web at all, let alone streaming content on the internet and all the other things it was doing. It was Stephen Conroy, the then Communications Minister, who in the dying days of the Rudd government had 5 crucial words inserted into the ABC Charter. They were to provide digital media services, thereby establishing that it was the ABC's job to do more than broadcasting in the literal and old-fashioned sense, do more than broadcasting over the broadcasting spectrum. Now, of course, the ABC was already doing it, already seizing the opportunities, but News Corporation, as you would expect, was seriously arguing that that was in excess of its charter and should be stopped. Imagine if that argument had been allowed to succeed. The ABC would be close to irrelevant now, and those changes happened so rapidly, over just less than 10 years, in fact. But thankfully, under Scott, and I do think this is his main achievement, the ABC continued full steam ahead into new media and social media, despite being buffeted and diminished by continuous funding cuts under the Abbott, Turnbull and Morrison governments. Scott used Twitter ably, and ABC employees were encouraged to do likewise. Q&A, which at the time was an agenda-setting program, not sure it still is, was enlivened by a Twitter stream on the bottom of the screen, and this was part of a vibe, an idea that was often explicitly stated, that the ABC were a means by which the nation could conduct its conversations. Scott called it the national town square, and the idea of a two-way interaction. But I don't need to tell you, the optimism didn't last. So many at the ABC got themselves into trouble or were caught in conduct unbecoming. When Scott's successor, Michelle Guthrie, was sacked by the board in 2018, journalist and Four Corners producer Sally Neighbour tweeted, "Excellent decision," which potentially undermined her ability to, in an impartial way, go on to produce a Four Corners programme about the things that led to Guthrie's sacking. Or in 2021, the ABC had to pick up the legal bill over Louise Milligan's defamation of Andrew Laming MP on Twitter again, and there are many more examples. As well, there was vitriol piled upon ABC people on social media. David Spears was attacked, largely because he wasn't Barry Cassidy. Stan Grant suffered. Lisa Miller faced astonishing abuse. So too Tony Armstrong. And of course, the most recent episode of self-damage, Antoinette Lattouf, was sacked because of what she tweeted, and the rights and wrongs of that case are not something I want to get into tonight. Alongside all this, the atmosphere of optimism about social media has declined, both within the ABC and outside it. Now, ABC reporters are strongly discouraged from using it, and I understand why. But I do want to challenge some of where this pessimism is taking us, because I think it's dangerous, and I think there are better ways, and I think the ABC could be part of them. In November last year, the Albanese government passed legislation to prevent those under the age of 16 from having social media accounts. These laws are set to take effect at the end of this year, and they're the world's first ban on social media for young people. Exactly how it will work, even whether it can work, is still being worked out. Support for the laws is bipartisan between the two main political parties, though they're opposed by the Greens and many of the independents. Albanese, of course, has been congratulated internationally for standing up to the digital behemoths. Polling data shows that a majority of Australians are in favour of this ban. But a majority of academics and specialists in the field are opposed, and I am one of them. It's not because I am numb to the damage wrought through social media, or because I love the work of Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg and the like. Far from it. Albanese himself has said that his ban is unlikely to work perfectly or completely. He wants to send a social message, a sign to parents and to young people themselves about the dangers. Well, I support sending such a message. I'm all in favour of a conversation about better parenting in the age of social media, better civic participation, and, most of all, the responsibilities of publishers, which is, at least in part, what these digital platforms are. They have at least as much responsibility as Andrew Bent in his time. But since when was passing laws and restricting access to a means of political speech the best way for the government to send a message about the appropriate behaviour of citizens? Since when did we embrace such incursions on our freedom? What do you think Andrew Bent would say about that? What are we doing when we try to say to young people, almost old enough to be ripped off in the gig economy, almost old enough to be sent to war, that they're not old enough to post a TikTok dance video, or to make a comment on Twitter? When Greta Thunberg first downloaded Instagram in June 2018, the Swedish schoolgirl used the app to post pictures of herself with her rescue dog, Roxy. But within months, when she was just 15, she used the same account to announce she was going on her school strike to protest lack of action on climate change. In a long post, she said she was going to sit outside the Swedish Parliament, and she encouraged other teenagers to do likewise. #ClimateStrike. If Albanese's legislation had applied to Thunberg in Sweden at the time, we would probably never have heard of her. Or closer to home in Tasmania, Grace Tame was a teenager when she was abused by a teacher, and even once she turned 18, she was prevented by Tasmania's Evidence Act from speaking out about her abuse, although her abuser was quite happy to speak about her. Her campaign to change those laws, #LetHerSpeak, was largely conducted on social media, and only then came to the attention of the mainstream. Voices previously hidden are heard through social media. That is both its strength and its great danger. There are plenty of other examples which I won't go through. Social media isn't benign, it's powerful. That's why it both hurts and empowers. Now, let us be clear, unlike Andrew Bent, these young people won't be jailed for their freedom of speech should they manage to circumvent the restrictions. The law applies to the digital platforms themselves, not to their users. Nor do young people use social media mainly for political speech. Their dance videos on TikTok, for example, and of course masses of trivia. But then artistic expression, surely what's happening on TikTok, is also freedom of speech. So it's not the equivalent of what happened to Andrew Bent, who was jailed for what he published. Rather, it is as if he had been prevented from accessing the means of publication, as if he had not been apprenticed to a publisher at the age of 15, banned, in fact, from learning the skills he later deployed. Now, Albanese is acting partly because of an increasing conviction that social media is damaging young people, and there's been quite a lot of publication on this, including by the American author Jonathan Haidt, who's been a big influence on Albanese. But as a detailed review in Nature magazine noted, while Haidt is an excellent storyteller, the evidence is actually thin. Yes, there is a rise in social media use. Yes, there is a rise in mental illness and anxiety in this generation. There is very little evidence, in fact, none that stands to scrutiny, that one causes the other. Correlation is not causation. And of course, there are plenty of other reasons for young people to be anxious and depressed. We ban the means of them expressing their distress while failing to tackle the thing they are surely right to be worried about, climate change and war. Now, to tie this back to the ABC, you'll be relieved to hear, its present and its future. I've said I'll talk about democracy in the ABC, and obviously that means the journalism, and I'll get to that. But democracy isn't only about journalism. It's also about identity and about being able to have your voice and feeling part of the community and having agency within it. The period I'm writing about in my book includes the end of internal television production in Tasmania. Some of you will remember Gardening Australia being produced out of studios here in Hobart, and then The Collectors. That all ended in 2012 to 2014. You will know better than I what happens when a locus of cultural production is moved out of a community the size of this one. It's disempowering. Yes, there are still stories about regional Australia, Backroads, for example. And there are stories set in Tasmania on the ABC, Bay of Fires. But I don't think that's a substitute. There's a sense of being the subject rather than active producer of one's story when outsiders fly in to do the creative work. I realise I'm exactly that, an outsider flying in to do the creative work, but I was invited. This decline of localism is also about democracy, because democracy is about, or doesn't work without a sense of participation and agency in a society, a sense of identity. Who am I? How does that relate to my community, suburb, state, nation? Disaffection, feeling alienated and powerless, is a pathology, and we see its worst expressions in the anxiety of our young people. Now, the ABC does a great deal to address this. What is the evidence for the often asserted claim that the ABC is good for our democracy? Well, like many public things, public health, public housing, the benefits are hard to prove. They're about bad things not happening, and therefore never being thought about, rather than good things happening that politicians can take credit for. But there is, in the academic literature, plenty of evidence that a healthier democracy and public life is correlated with healthy public service media. In the USA, for example, public broadcasting does exist, still, just, but it's always been a bit player. The USA ranks near the bottom on OECD lists comparing per capita funding for public broadcasting. Switzerland is top, by the way, and Australia is equal 13th with Japan. A 2016 study from the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism compared public broadcasting and private media, comparing those two kinds of media, found that public service media broadcast more news and current events at peak times and more hard news. And that was strongly correlated with increased public knowledge of a variety of hard news topics. And with that came positive indicators on trust and social cohesion. And the evidence suggests that this effect is not limited to the direct audience for public service media. It's not only people who actually watch or listen or read the ABC. Another study compared news consumption and public affairs knowledge in 6 European countries and found those with public service television had notably better levels of public knowledge about public events, including among those people who didn't watch the public broadcaster. So even those who are uninterested in news are better informed than they might otherwise be. The effect of good public service media spreads through the ecosystem and changes it for the better. Now, with some reservations, because the studies aren't perfect, I think these studies make the case for the democratic importance of public service media. And of course, that's bolstered by lots of other research, including the ABC's own. But how might the ABC do better, given the rapidity of change in media is not changing? If anything, it's speeding up. It's about funding, obviously, but not only funding. I'll start by looking at the recent past and the issues I've been talking about concerning social media. Just imagine if, in 2006, we had seen what was coming. What might we have done? Surely we would have wanted social media to be in public hands, like a utility. Certainly we would have wanted it regulated at the very least from the outset. What if the world's public broadcasters, ABC, BBC, all the others, had banded together and created their own social media platform? Would we have funded them to do so? Would we have recognised the importance of doing that? And if they had, how would public broadcasters have handled the algorithms that today help to divide us, drive some of us down conspiracy rabbit holes and help to make us crazy? Differently, surely. Better, surely. There would likely have been an ABC Kids social media channel with the same ethos and protections, but also permissions and licence, such that make the ABC Kids app such a trusted and indispensable part of children's and parents' lives and grandparents. Behind the News, for example, would have been on social media, a conversation as a broadcast, and the Andrew Bents of our own time might have learnt their media skills in conversation and interaction with ABC platforms. Social media has been a force for good and evil. Its benefits and shortcomings are the same, that voices previously not heard in the mainstream media are suddenly visible and amplified. We're confronted with each other. People are able to organise in new ways. But lies spread as quickly or more quickly than the truth, as we see most powerfully in the phenomenon such as QAnon and the role it played in US politics and the growth of the MAGA movement. Now, Australia is not immune to these currents. We shouldn't be complacent. But so far, our politics has been less susceptible than that in the USA and many other countries. And one of the reasons for that is a strong public broadcaster. Good public service media has a sanity-spreading effect. And we've seen that powerfully demonstrated, I think, recently, whatever you think of the recent federal election result. It is quite clear that Peter Dutton and his supporters fell into the trap of believing that Sky News After Dark was the nation, that the dialogue that you have there reflects the nation as a whole. Thus, he dismissed the ABC as hate media, which is kind of strange. But the Australian public chose differently, and I think generally is much closer and more closely reflects the sort of sanity and balance of the ABC. Now, we need sanity, definitely. And if there are better mechanisms than restrictive laws to address the undoubted problems of social media, then public service media is surely a potential asset in finding and implementing those better mechanisms. But this digression into the recent past is most useful, I think, as a guide for the future. I want to talk about artificial intelligence. Don't be kidded, it's upon us right now. If you're using Google Maps, if you're using any search engine, then you're already using artificial intelligence. Now, we're right at the beginning of this. We're at the equivalent of 2006 and social media. And it's very hard to see where it's going. One of the things I do, I'm on the board of the Scott Trust, which is the owner of the Guardian newspaper worldwide. Last week we had a meeting that was all about AI and how we're to deal with the AI companies. There's a threat to media business models, again, old story, because people are already being satisfied with an AI-generated summary of what news sources say rather than clicking through to the mastheads. AI is already being used to write headlines, which it actually does quite well. And it's also used to write those quite useful key points things that you find at the head of articles, including on the ABC website. It can analyse data and point out trends and inconsistencies that merit human investigation, so it's useful for journalists. It can, when you feed it with sufficient content, produce formulaic stories, 5 things to do in Hobart, for example, sports results and that sort of thing. But it can't do actual journalism, by which I mean going to places, talking to people, observing and reporting on the results with judgment and clarity. So far, that quintessential task of bearing witness remains an innately and essentially human activity. And while it's hard to see what's ahead, I actually don't expect that to change. But we're right at the beginning of the story. Right now, in fact, this very week, in fact, probably today, mainstream media companies across the world are signing licensing agreements with AI companies that allow those companies to use media content for news products, including those that have not yet been invented, and in some cases not even dreamt of. It may be that they are in the process of signing away the remaining dregs of mainstream media power. So using the trajectory of social media and what we might have done had we understood what was coming, how might we use the tradition of strong public broadcasting right now? What should we be demanding the government do when we argue for more government funding for the ABC? I think the ABC should be being proactive about media change, and governments should be supporting it to be so, indeed insisting that it be so. It's so much of a better response than restrictive laws. We should be tasking the ABC with exploring the uses of artificial intelligence for a better public conversation. The world's public broadcasters should, I think, be founding artificial intelligence tools rather than just working out how to deal with the ones that are being created by others. Alongside and as part of this, we need more journalists bearing witness, more connected news. I think that suggests more localism, not only regional but suburban, and perhaps particularly the urban edge, where a new generation of Australians are growing up and disconnection and alienation are rife. We need more creators throughout our nation, but the content they create can be searchable, distributable, intelligible and interrogatable in new ways. The aim should be to provide a trusted set of tools using AI, but managed and moderated on behalf of us all. We need the ABC to have seriousness of purpose, certainly. It needs to respect its traditions and its values, but it also needs to change. So it's not only about more funding, it's about imaginative leadership and courageous thinking. And I hope for more of both from those who make decisions about funding the ABC, to those of us who have to pay for it, to those who manage and staff it. Let's think about the spirit of Andrew Bent, that young man just out of childhood when he began his journey to Australia. He was a disruptor, brave, fully stepping into the responsibilities of a citizen, even though he was a convict, fully engaged with the communication tools of his time. He had a particular power, and we remember him, because he owned a printing press. He had the means of publication in his hands. Today we all have those means of publication in our hands, in your phone, in your lap. And there's much to be celebrated in that. In this age, good citizenship requires us to be responsible participants in the new media world. And because of our tradition of public broadcasting, we are well placed, better than many other nations, to deal with the challenges ahead. We need to recognise and embrace that strength and insist that governments do likewise. Thank you. Is this what you want?
Thank you, Margaret. Now I'm going to join Margaret and invite everybody to ask a few questions. Just to introduce myself, I'm Alana Mann and I am very proud to represent the University of Tasmania in hosting the event tonight. And I will have the first question. So when I sit down...
Scared.
If you don't mind.
No.
Thank you. That was immensely heartwarming and optimistic to hear as a media and communications educator. So I would like to thank you, because we are teaching a generation of young people who I think really need to embrace your vision and realise all the possibilities for scholarship, employment and application that your vision presents. And my question is, it struck me the tension, in fact the total disconnect between the policy of limiting young people's access to social media and then expecting them to become the digital, if you like, artists and intellectual, engaged digital natives that they need to be to achieve your vision. So what should we be doing in universities to help prevent some of the missteps that, and as a former Fairfaxer, I was there, how do we avoid those mistakes? What can we do as we train our young journalists of the future?
Yeah, easy question first. So I also have been a journalism educator, of course, and still do a bit of teaching. We had to revise our curriculum every year, probably every 6 months would have been better, in order to try and take account of the change. I used to have 2 subjects which had generic names, something like change in media and media futures or something, into which I would pile all the stuff that didn't fit anywhere else, but which I thought it was essential for them to be thinking about or to know, and that's where you'd put the most up-to-date readings and that sort of thing. Also, of course, listen to the students, because they are much more connected with this than we are. My Chinese students particularly, I used to find hugely insightful into the impact of WeChat and Weibo and the Chinese social media platforms, which of course are massive and massively powerful. So that's, one short answer to your question. In terms of the legislation, I mean, there's a great deal that Albanese is doing with the digital platforms that I admire. There's another part of the media policy is the news media incentive, which proposes to use the tax system to levy them, with that money to be distributed to public interest journalism. I think that's a great idea and I support it. In fact, I've been lobbying for something like that for years. And he does deserve congratulations for his courage in taking on not only the social media platforms, but also Trump, who who's quoted those very laws, when he's talking about tariffs. But I just think the restriction on teenage use of social media is completely wrong-headed and dangerous. Yes.
Absolutely. It might be better if we ban some of our media moguls from social media use, in fact.
I think Trump would agree with you at the moment.
Oh, actually. Yes, touché. Now, I know the audience will have many questions for you, and if I could just ask Saxon to just bring up the lights a little, I will look forward to seeing some hands come up, please. Yes. Thank you. So has anyone got a question to start Margaret off with? Yes.
Thank you, Margaret. That was a great discussion, starting point, I should say. And I guess my question is to do with, you talk a lot about the sort of the role of democracy and the public service broadcaster. Now, the public service inherently, I would say, is risk averse. I think of it as this shambling, slow kind of monster. And I see also that maybe, like we were talking about, what would we do in 2006 had we the knowledge that we have now? And what that speaks to me is of innovation, and it's hard to be innovative when you are inherently risk averse. And, when the media is so quick, I suppose, how do you fail? I just am curious to know what you think about being innovative in a sphere where it is I guess, highly judged.
Yeah, it's very hard to be innovative on inadequate funding and when you're constantly under attack. I should say that when I use the phrase public service media, I don't mean public service as in the public service. I mean media for the service of the public, although both are true, but that's the sense in which I use the term. Because, the public broadcasters are there to serve the population rather than shareholders and advertisers and so on. But yeah, the difficulties of being innovative are enormous. I mean, the ABC is, not a flawless institution by any means. A large part of my book is about, horrible internal factional fights. It can be a terribly bruising place in which to work for everybody. You see that sort of, putting its head above the parapet every now and again. We all get an insight into that. But it's a really tough place to work. It tends to be warring fiefdoms with everybody fighting like seagulls over a limited number of chips. And a lot of that can be very destructive. Nevertheless, the story I told about Scott's time, it did innovate. Not everything it did was good, not everything it did was lasted, but as Scott has said to me, I've interviewed him a number of times for the book, he said, I didn't know what the future held, but I knew it was sort of broadly that away, and we had to keep moving and maintain momentum. But in 2014, when the big cuts came under the Abbott government, when Turnbull was Minister for Communications, really big cuts. And Scott actually made a very tough decision through that. He cut deeper than, strictly speaking, he needed to in order to be able to invest in iView and digital media, in order to be able to do iView in HD, for example, to be able to allow it to send you recommendations, you enjoyed this, you might enjoy the other, because it was competing against the Netflixes and the Stans and all that sort of thing. Now, that was a difficult decision. Again, I'm not saying everything he did was right, but the fact is those courageous decisions were made, and we should be glad of that. I think David Anderson also made courageous decisions of that kind. The big transformation was under Scott, but David Anderson continued in those directions. Too soon to say about the current crew.
This raises an interesting question for me about the right people to lead media organisations these days. When I was at Fairfax and Fred Hilmer turned up, he was very, very unpopular for not being a media person, and that wasn't the only reason. But actually, who is best suited to run a modern media company in this age of AI?
Very good question. There's no simple answer to that, because if you start sort of categorising people by background or previous experience, you know, there are examples of successes and failures. But, you know, courage is certainly part of it, being in touch with what's happening is part of it, but also, I think, trying to remember why you're doing the whole thing at all. Yeah, I mean, for journalism, I mean, this is perhaps less the case for drama and entertainment and so on, but for journalism, there's actually quite a lot of encouraging evidence out there for journalists who care about journalism, because, you know, we went through a stage, you know, at the time that Fairfax newspapers were going down the tube and all the rest of it, where people thought, oh, everybody wants clickbait, we should all invest in clickbait, or everybody wants to read opinion. Well, of course, people do read opinion, they always have, they always will, that won't change, and people click on clickbait, I do it myself, but they don't pay for it. And the serious journalism outlets, New York Times, The Guardian, now draw more than half their revenue from the money the readers pay. Whereas when I started my career, back when Tyrannosaurus Rex roamed the earth, it was 80% advertising revenue, 20% from readers. Now it's about 50-50, and the readers section is growing. So what do people pay for? Actually, journalism, good journalism. Done in new ways, using new tools, published differently, but the central value of telling important stories with truth and integrity is the same. Yeah. So I think one of the things is to have good values and to keep reviewing them, don't be conservative, but remember that there's a reason why we do this in the first place, particularly relevant to the ABC. Yeah. Mm.
Absolutely. Instead of thinking about clickbait, maybe Fairfax should have thought about cars and real estate.
Well, they certainly should have, and that's Hilmer's big failure.
Who has another question? Dave.
Margaret, do you think the ABC is trying to do too much with too little? I mean, it has got a pretty big budget there, and there's been a lot of complaints, and I don't think the public really understand the bureaucracy in the ABC. There's so much of it. It all started, I believe, with Sir Talbot Duck-Manton, where bureaucracy, OBE, it all became, the bureaucracy was the most important thing, and it grew and grew and grew, where there's not much money left for program making. Do you think it should cut back and do things which it's really good at, instead of trying to do everything for everybody?
In some areas, yes, and I'll talk about what I think some of those areas are in a minute. It should be said, though, that the ABC today is very different from what Duck-Manton left behind. There are many fewer managers. It's still formidably bureaucratic, there's no doubt about that. Some of that's forced upon it. It has to constantly account for itself, appear before send estimates, you know, all the rest of it, fight for money, obviously. And it has to be accountable because it's taxpayer funded, so that's appropriate. So all of that carries a cost of being the ABC. But there have been numerous efficiency reviews into the ABC. It's a regular for a new government to commission an efficiency review into the ABC. None of them have found that it's bloated and inefficient. They've all sort of nibbled around the corners and made suggestions, but the general picture is that it's a pretty lean organisation these days. And of course, which goes to the beginning of your question, it's doing much, much more than it ever did before. You know, it's no longer only one television station and a handful of radio stations. It's also web pages, it's mobile apps, it's, you know, it's iView, it's streaming. It's doing much more with less. And should it do less? Well, here are some things we might consider. ABC2, do we really need it when we've got iView as well? When ABC2 was first founded, it was a time-shifting station, so if you'd missed something on the main channel, you could catch up with it on ABC2. And then for a while, it was the home of Australian comedy, and then they stopped doing that because you could stream Australian comedy anywhere. And then it became a children's channel during the day. But, you know, it's sort of knocked around. We also have SBS2, so we've got, two public broadcaster channels, neither of which I think has a clear reason for being. In the age of iView and SBS Online, SBS On Demand, I think you could probably get rid of them. Then there is a whole troubled question about drama. For example, FISC. Obviously the ABC, as I'm sure you all know, doesn't make its own drama anymore, very much, at all. So it's all commissioned from outside. The ABC is usually very important to that commissioning process. But take FISC, for example, which you can now watch on Netflix. There'll be a whole generation who encounter FISC on Netflix and never realise that it's an ABC show. Does that matter? Should the ABC perhaps just be a pot of money and a commissioning team and not worry about it going on to the ABC main channel? At what point will terrestrial broadcasting for television end altogether and we will all be just streaming TV, including ABC TV? Nobody knows the answer to that question. It's not yet, that's for sure. But it's probably in sight. Probably during my lifetime, they will switch off the TV signal and we will all be streaming. So what does that do to your drama slate, to the whole idea of having a current events Monday and a comedy Wednesday and, the lineup that we've all become familiar with to ABC One? So there will be opportunities to ask the question you're asking, are we doing too much and what should we stop doing? But it's difficult because every time the ABC does something new, it has to stop doing something old. And every time it stops doing something old, it annoys all of its audience over 50. But if it doesn't get audiences in their 20s, 30s and 40s, then in 30 years we won't have an ABC. So it's a really difficult question.
That's so true. I remember when the Sydney Morning Herald moved the crossword one day. We never had so much mail. Someone at the back. Oh, thanks, Saxon.
Hello. I'm a secondary school teacher, so I deal with the opposite side of students learning to use AI and navigate those systems. In its current state, what I have to spend a lot of time doing is kind of unteaching them what the AI has just kind of misled them by just 10 to 20% fairly consistently, and trying to give them the skills to do that themselves. So when you were talking about the ABC maybe embracing those tools as well, it broke my heart a little bit in terms of there's this one place, or there's a few places that remain where you can send a young person and they know everything they read there has been checked by a person. Do you see those kind of kinks and hallucinations that are pretty prevalent across all of the platforms I've tried to use with my students, because I am trying to future-proof them a little bit? Do you see that being resolved somehow in the future? Is there a kind of optimism to your comments about it so far?
Well, first of all, I would say the reason I want the ABC to embrace these tools is because they will do it better. They will care about things like accuracy. That's the point. If the ABC had run Facebook, for example, it wouldn't be Facebook. It would be something much healthier and better and more constructive. That's why I want public service media to get involved in these tools, so that your students can use the tools and in a positive environment, or a factual environment. Do I think they'll get better? I think they are getting better all the time at quite a rapid rate. I was saying to Rowan actually that probably about 18 months ago, I asked an AI engine about myself, that thing you do, Googling yourself. And what came back was mostly fine and accurate, but then it also said she also wrote the book The Lost Boys. I did not write the book The Lost Boys. I looked up The Lost Boys. There's about 5 books of that name. I didn't write any of them, and nor did anybody called Margaret Simons write any of them. Just complete bizarre hallucination. Now, Rowan was saying he'd check me on social media. I don't think it's saying that on AI. I don't think it's saying that anymore. So, a little example. So I do think it will get better. I think they're getting better at a scary rate. But one thing I would say about your work is God bless you for doing it, because the only alternative to what Albanese is doing is to teach our young people how to use these tools, how to engage with them, how to be sceptical of them where that's necessary, and how to make them better, because it will be them who'll have to do that. And so media literacy programs in schools and technical programs in schools are absolutely at the front line of this, and I'm really glad to hear that you're doing it. I appreciate that it's not easy.
And I'd love to talk to you about how we can work better with schools, because we have students coming from high school who have, in many cases, better digital skills than their instructors, but at the same time, as you're mentioning, lack that critical, analytical ability that often only comes with experience. And I have to say, we develop that with legacy media, a lot of those skills. So how are we going to bring those ethics along with us without that?
Well, that's what I want the ABC and public broadcasters worldwide to start engaging with, to start thinking through the answer to that question. Yeah.
It's an important project. Probably got time for one more really juicy question. Thanks.
Well, I hope. Oh, I hope it's not too juicy. I was wondering whether you listened to, heard a replay of the podcast. It was either yesterday or the day before on ABC Radio National, probably, Science, and it was about neurolinguistic cognitive communication skill development in teenagers. It was just excellent. And I think in the conclusion, they were tending to be recommending that teachers engage the students to become more critical and analytical of digital media by going off the media and discussing in a more old-fashioned way.
IRL, in real life, isn't it? The young people say it, yeah. Yeah, I didn't hear the program, I'm afraid, but I'd make the general comment that there are some things that only the ABC does. A program I was going to mention in the speech, but I thought I was going on too long, was You Can't Ask That. Do you watch that? Which is one of the cheapest programs the ABC has ever made. I interviewed John Casimir, who was the mind behind it, a couple of weeks ago. When they first started out, it was $50,000 an episode, which is just dirt cheap, right? And of course it is deceptively simple, people sitting in front of a plain background answering questions. It's the most successful format the ABC has ever done. They've sold it overseas into numerous countries, and it's made a mozza for the ABC, as well as being very good in itself. But imagine the concept, when you're pitching that, let's get a whole load of underrepresented groups that, face a lot of prejudice and get them to answer questions. I mean, can you imagine that flying on Channel 9? Only the ABC would do a show like that. And of course, it's been a phenomenal and low-cost success. So much so that some see it as a problem because they're saying everybody thinks every show can be made for $50,000 an episode, which of course is not true. I was just writing the other day about Sarah Ferguson did an incredible series called Hitting Home back in about 2016, I think, 2017, which was about domestic violence. She basically went and lived in a shelter, women's shelter, for about 6 months. Again, only the ABC would do that. There's a whole load of things that only the ABC do, and although I didn't hear the show that you're talking about, it sounds like there's another one.
Well, on that note, I would like to ask you to join me in thanking who is probably remarkably as lucid and as intelligent in person as she is on the page. And as an absolute fan of your journalism for many years, it's been a thrill. And thank you so much for joining us and sharing your amazing intellect and optimistic vision with us, Margaret.
Well, thank you for having me.